The night Marcus Hale stood up in the middle of his own estate and made the announcement, there were 47 people in that room. I know because I counted them later, the way you count things after they stop making sense. 47 people, every one of them with a net worth that would make most people's heads swim, and every single one of them laughed, not meanly. Just the comfortable laugh of people who knew a joke when they heard one, who understood that what Marcus Hale was saying was theater, not policy, because what he was describing was simply not possible. His daughter, Elise Hale, was 34 years old. She held degrees from MIT and Johns Hopkins. She had published research in 3 different scientific disciplines before she was 30. She had competed at the national level in chess for 6 years running and had never, not once, lost a match to anyone her father had brought to the table. The condition Marcus attached to her hand, beat her at her own game, any game she chooses, in front of witnesses, was the most elegant locked door anyone in that room had ever seen, because the key to that lock simply did not exist. I was not in that room. I was outside in the driveway, lifting the last of the event's trash bags into the back of my truck. My name is Roy Calder. I am 51 years old. I have driven a garbage truck for the city of Millhaven for going on 19 years. I have a daughter of my own named Josie. She is 26 now, and I have raised her alone since she was 4 years old when her mother decided that the life of a garbage man's wife was not the life she had pictured. I do not say that with bitterness anymore. I said it with bitterness for about 3 years, and then I ran out of bitterness the way you run out of gas, and I just kept driving without it. Josie turned out to be the finest person I have ever known, and I have known a lot of people across 19 years of picking up what the world throws away. You learn things in this work that you cannot learn any other way. The things people discard tell you everything about them that their public faces are designed to hide. I have found wedding rings in trash bags. I have found children's report cards. I have found, once, a whole box full of letters tied with kitchen twine that somebody had clearly written and never sent, each one addressed to the same name in handwriting that got more desperate as the stack went on. I did not read them. But I held that box for a long moment before I put it in the truck, and I thought about whoever had thrown it away, and whether they felt lighter or emptier for having done it. And I thought that those two things are probably the same feeling, wearing different names. I am invisible in this work the same way a piece of furniture is invisible. People look through you rather than at you. I have stood 6 feet from conversations that would have made headlines and been treated like a post in the ground because I was wearing a reflective vest and holding a bag. And I want to be very honest with you, because I think you deserve honesty more than you deserve a comfortable story. I stopped minding being invisible a long time ago, not because I gave up, but because I learned that the things you see when nobody knows you are watching are realer than almost anything people choose to show. So when I tell you what I saw and heard that night in the Hale driveway, understand that I was not eavesdropping. I was just there, doing my job, and nobody thought to lower their voice on my account. The Hale estate sat at the end of a long gravel road outside Millhaven proper, on about 12 acres of manicured land that backed up to a reservoir. The main house was stone and timber, old money in its bones, the kind of house that doesn't need to show off because it has never once worried about being noticed. Marcus Hale had made his money in industrial logistics, 30 years of building something unglamorous into something enormous, and he had the particular manner of a man who had gotten rich the slow way and never forgotten how long it took. He was 71. His wife, Catherine, had died 6 years earlier. After that, as best as I could piece together from the fragments that float around a small city like Millhaven, Marcus had turned his considerable attention and considerable energy toward one remaining project, finding a man worthy of his daughter. I had been to the Hale estate 4 times before that night on regular residential collection days. The estate generated more trash in a week than most houses did in a month, because Marcus Hale entertained constantly, not frivolously. He entertained the way businessmen of his generation entertained, strategically, with purpose, with an eye always toward the person across the table and what they might become useful for. The night of the announcement was a dinner party for what I gathered were about a dozen of his closest business associates and their families, 47 people total. I had been called for a special pickup because the caterers had generated more waste than the property's bins could hold. I arrived at 9 in the evening. The party was still in full swing inside. I went around to the service entrance and started loading. The announcement must have happened around 9:15, because that is when I heard the tone of the house change. You learn to read the acoustics of a building from the outside the same way you learn to read anything, with enough patience and enough evenings spent standing in the dark with your ears open. The laughter that came through the dining room windows at 9:15 was the specific kind of laughter that follows something theatrical. Warm, a little surprised, delighted but not alarmed. The laughter of people who had just been told something they were absolutely certain would never actually come to pass. I heard Marcus Hale's voice clearly through an open window. He had the voice of a man who had run meetings for 40 years, unhurried, projecting without effort. He said, "Any man in this room, or any man any of you know, who can sit down across from my Elise and beat her at a game of her choosing in front of witnesses, I will give that man my blessing, my respect and my full support in asking for her hand." The laughter came again, warmer this time, and then I heard a woman's voice, lower, dry, with the precision of someone who has spent years making sure every word lands exactly where she intends it. She said, "He means it, actually. He has said this before. The problem is I have never lost." More laughter. And then the window closed, and I went back to loading bags, and I thought about it for approximately 11 seconds before I set it aside and finished the job, and drove back to the depot. But I did not forget it. You do not forget a thing like that when you have a daughter of your own. My Josie had been through a version of this, not with formal announcements at dinner parties, but with a quiet parade of men who wanted her for what they could see, and not for what was underneath what they could see. Josie had her mother's looks and my stubbornness, and her own particular intelligence that operated sideways from how most people think. And she had spent her 20s being badly underestimated by men who mistook her patience for softness and her silence for agreement. I had watched her navigate it with more grace than I would have managed, and it had taught me something about what a woman who has never once been properly seen actually looks like when she stands in a room full of people performing for her. She looks tired. She looks like someone holding a door shut from the inside. I want to stop here and make something clear, because the story I am about to tell you could easily be misunderstood if you are listening for the wrong things. I did not go back to the Hale estate because I had romantic intentions toward Eliza Hale. I am a 51-year-old garbage man with a bad knee and a truck that needs a new alternator. That is not false modesty. That is just the actual facts of my life as I understand them. I went back because of what I overheard 3 weeks after the dinner party at the second special pickup. When the estate hosted a chess exhibition that Marcus Hale had apparently organized as the first formal attempt to find a man who could meet his condition, 7 men had accepted the challenge. 7 men with credentials, with pedigrees, with the kind of confidence that comes from never having been told no by anyone whose opinion they respected. I loaded bags in the driveway while, through the open window of what I later learned was the Hale Library, I listened to 6 of those 7 men lose. I did not hear the games themselves. What I heard was the aftermath. The particular silence that follows a defeat that someone was not prepared for. The sound of a chair pushed back from a table. The polite murmuring of witnesses who are trying to be gracious about something that was never really going to be a contest. And then I heard the 7th man. He did not lose quietly. He disputed a move. He raised his voice. He said, in the tone of a man who had never once considered the possibility that the person across from him was simply better, that this was not how the game was supposed to go. I heard Marcus Hale say, calmly, that he thought it was time for the gentlemen to leave. I heard a door close. I heard, in the silence that followed, A single short laugh from the woman with the dry voice. Just one, like a period at the end of a sentence. I sat in my truck for a moment before I started the engine. I was thinking about chess. I want to tell you something about chess and garbage men, because I suspect you have an assumption about the relationship between those two things, and I want to address it directly. I learned chess from my father, who learned it from his father, who had been a machinist in a shipyard for 40 years and had played every evening after dinner at the kitchen table until the day he died. My grandfather was the finest chess player I have ever known, and he never once in his life set foot inside a library, and he owned 2 suits, and he smelled permanently of metal shavings. He taught me the game the way he taught me everything, without explanation, by demonstration, by letting me lose until I understood why I had lost, and then letting me lose again in a different way until I understood that too. I played through my 20s at a community center in Millionaire, where a group of retired men met on Thursday evenings. I played through my 30s at the same table, but with different men, because the original ones had mostly died or moved away. I played through my 40s mostly against Josie, who I had taught the same way my grandfather taught me, by letting her lose until she started to win, and then watching her get better than me by the time she was 17. And feeling about that the specific pride that you can only feel when the person who beats you is someone you love more than winning. I am not a grandmaster. I am not anything with a title. I am a garbage man who has played chess for 4 decades because it was the thing my grandfather and I shared, and because when I sit down at a board I hear his voice in the quality of the silence. That is the full extent of my qualification. That is the only thing I brought to the Hale estate on the evening of November 4th, a Tuesday, when I drove out there not in my truck, but in my own car, my 2009 Civic with the cracked dashboard, in clean clothes, and knocked on the front door instead of going around to the service entrance. The man who answered was not Marcus Hale. It was a household manager named Gerald, who I had spoken to briefly on the collection days, and who looked at me now with the careful neutrality of a man who is paid to be courteous to everyone, equally regardless of what he personally thinks of the situation. I told him I had heard about the standing offer. I told him I wanted to request a chance. Gerald looked at me for a moment. He said he would check with Mr. Hale. He closed the door. He opened it again 4 minutes later and said Mr. Hale would see me in the study. Marcus Hale was standing when I came in. He was a tall man, still straight in the back despite 71 years, with the hands of someone who had worked physically before he worked managerially, and had never entirely lost the look of that. He studied me the way I had seen men of his generation study things they were trying to take a fast, accurate measure of. He said, "I know you." I told him I drove the residential collection for this route. He said, "Roy." "Yes, sir." He said, "You want to try your luck with Elise?" I said, "I heard about the standing offer. I thought I would ask." He looked at me for another moment. Then he said something I did not expect. He said, "I am going to tell you what I tell every man who comes through that door. I am not running a circus, and my daughter is not a prize at a fair. If she is in the room with you, she is choosing to be there. If she walks away, the evening is over and no one says a word about it, ever. You understand?" I said I understood. He said, "She will be down in 20 minutes. He offered me a chair. He did not stay in the room himself. I sat and waited. The study was full of books that had actually been read. You can tell the difference. The spines are broken differently on a book that has been read versus a book that has been bought and placed. The entire room had the quality of a place where someone spent real hours, not a room designed to make visitors think that someone spent real hours. There was a chess set on a table near the window, not a decorative one. The pieces were weighted tournament regulation, slightly yellowed with age on the white pieces, the board itself marked at the edges from years of use. She came in without knocking, which was her house and her right. She was taller than I expected, and she had her father's way of standing, that particular ease that comes from never having had to make yourself small in a room. She looked at me with the expression I had heard in her voice through the window. Dry, precise, not unkind, but not performing warmth either. She said, "You are the garbage man." I said, she said, "My father told me." She looked at the chess set. She said, "You play?" I said, "Since I was 7. She sat down on the other side of the board. She did not offer to let me have white. She took white, which is the opening move advantage, which is the choice of someone who intends to control the tempo from the beginning. I did not say anything about it. I just sat down. What I want to tell you about the next 2 hours is that it was not a performance. That is the thing about chess that people who have not played seriously do not understand. You cannot perform chess. You can perform the gestures of chess, the confident hand moving the piece, the long considering pause, the small nod after a response, but the game itself is not affected by performance. The game only responds to thought. And what I had, sitting across from Elise Hale in her father's study, with a clock ticking on the window ledge and the November dark pressing against the glass, was 44 years of thought laid down in my hands, so deep that I did not always know where it came from. My grandfather's voice was in that room with me, not as a memory, as a structure, as the reason I saw 4 moves before she played the third one and shifted my own line accordingly without letting my face show that I had. She was very good. I want to be absolutely honest with you about that, because anything less than honesty would make this story into something cheap. Elise Hale was the strongest player I had ever sat across from outside of my grandfather, and my grandfather had been dead for 11 years, and I had missed playing him every Thursday since. She was precise and she was fast, and she thought in patterns that I recognized as someone who had not just learned the game, but had studied it at a level I had never had access to. Tournaments and theory, and the kind of formal training that requires money and mentorship that no one in my family had ever had. But, and I want you to hear this because it is the whole point of everything, she played the way someone plays when they have always won. There is a quality to that kind of play. It is brilliant and it is thorough, and it has one particular blindness built into it, the blindness of a person who has never had to learn from losing. You do not learn the same things from winning that you learn from losing. My grandfather taught me that. He taught me that by losing to me on purpose exactly once, when I was 14, and letting me watch him lose and watching me watch him, and then saying, "Now you know what it feels like to be in a position that looks winning and isn't." I played for 20 years after that, and I never forgot the feeling. Elise Hale had never had anyone do that for her. Not because she was arrogant, but because nobody had ever been able to. The game went to the 90-minute mark. She had my king under pressure in a way that I thought, for about 4 moves, was going to close it out. I let her think it was closing out for 3 of those 4 moves. On the 4th, I played a piece I had been holding in reserve since the 40-minute mark. A knight that had been sitting on the edge of the board doing what looked like nothing for 50 minutes and was actually doing the specific thing that move was about to do. She saw it the moment my hand left the piece. I watched her see it, not panic. She was not a person who panicked. But I watched the calculation change in her eyes, the quick traverse of what was now possible and what was no longer possible, and I watched her understand that the position she was in was not the position she had thought she was in. She sat with it for 11 minutes. That was when Marcus Hale came back to the room. He stood in the doorway and did not speak. He looked at the board. He looked at his daughter. She moved. I responded. She moved again. I responded. 3 more moves and she stopped. She looked at the board for a long moment with her hands flat on the table. Then she looked up at me. She said, "How?" Not a question, more like a word she needed to say out loud while she worked out the answer herself. I said, "My grandfather." She said, "Was he a teacher?" I said, "No. He drove a bus." She looked at me for a long moment. Then she did something I had not expected and could not have predicted. She laughed, not the short, dry laugh I had heard through the window. A real one. The kind that comes up from somewhere low and surprises the person it comes from. She said, "A bus driver's grandson just beat me." I said, "Yes, ma'am." She said, "Why did you come here? Not the estate. Why did you come to try?" She was asking me something real, and I think she deserved a real answer, so I gave her one. I said, "Because I heard what the seventh man said when he lost, and I thought that a woman who has never met someone who could lose with grace deserved to meet someone who could. I was not sure I would win, but I thought it was worth coming to find out either way." She looked at me for a long time after that. Marcus Hale, still in the doorway, made a sound that was not quite a word. She turned around and looked at her father and said, "I want to have a conversation with Mr. Calder. I think you should probably leave us alone for a little while." Marcus Hale, 71 years old, founder of a logistics company that operated in 32 states, looked at his daughter and then at me and then at his daughter again. Then he nodded once and closed the door. I want to be careful here about what I tell you next, because what happened in that room over the following hour belongs mostly to Elise, and I am not going to dress it up into something it was not. She did not fall in love with me in her father's study on a Tuesday evening in November. Love is not that fast, and it is not that clean, and anyone who tells you otherwise is selling you the version of a story, not the story itself. What happened was more like this. Two people who had both spent a very long time being looked at instead of seen sat in a room together and talked honestly for the first time in a while, and it turned out that honesty was something they were both extremely hungry for. She told me about what the last 3 years of her father's project had been like. The parade of men. The specific exhaustion of sitting across from person after person who was performing intelligence at her rather than actually thinking. Who wanted to win for reasons that had nothing to do with the game and everything to do with what winning would get them. She said, "Not one of them ever asked me why I play. Not one." I said, "Why do you play?" She was quiet for a moment. She said, "My mother taught me. She died 6 years ago. When I play, I still hear her coaching me." I thought about my grandfather. I said, "I know exactly what you mean." We talked until the clock on the window ledge said 11:40. Then she stood up, and I stood up, and she said she thought we should probably let her father back in before he wore a hole in the hallway carpet. I said that seemed reasonable. She put out her hand. I shook it. She said, "Same time next Thursday." "I want a rematch." I said, "I will be here." Marcus Hale came back into the room 5 minutes later. He looked at his daughter and then at me and then at the board. He looked at the board for a long time. He had played chess himself once. I could tell from the way he looked at the position, with the recognition of someone who understood what they were seeing. Then he looked at me. He said, "I have to ask you something direct." I said, "All right." He said, "You did not come here for what I was offering, did you?" It was not a question. I thought about how to answer it honestly. I said, "I came here because I heard about a woman who had never met her equal across a board, and I thought that sounded like a specific kind of loneliness that I happened to understand something about. I was not thinking about anything else." He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, "Sit down. I want to ask you about this route you drive." I sat back down. We talked for another 40 minutes. He asked about the logistics of residential collection, about the routing systems, about the union contracts, about the equipment, not to be polite. Because he was genuinely interested, the way engineers are interested in systems that they have never had reason to examine up close. He asked good questions. I gave him honest answers. At 12:30, he walked me to the door himself. Before I left, he said, "I want to be clear about one thing. If you come back Thursday, and any Thursday after that, it is because my daughter has asked you to come back, not because of anything I said in that dining room 3 weeks ago. I have never actually cared about the condition. I only cared about whether anyone would ever sit across from her and think about her as a person rather than a destination. You appear to have done that. So I will see you Thursday." I drove home that night on the empty road along the reservoir, and I thought about my grandfather, and about Josie, and about the way a game of chess played in a warm room in November can sometimes say more than years of careful words. I thought about the 47 people who had laughed at Marcus Hale's announcement, and how the thing that had actually been impossible was not the chess, which was only a game, but the simplicity of one person treating another person as though they were worth being honest with, and asking for nothing in return, except the same honesty back. I thought about Josie, who was going to have a lot of opinions about this when I told her, and who was going to express all of them, loudly, in the specific way she had expressed opinions loudly for 26 years. And how that was the thing about her I had loved most from the beginning. I called her the next morning. She was quiet for a moment after I told her the whole story. Then she said, "Dad, you beat a woman with 2 advanced degrees at chess on a Tuesday night, and then asked her for a rematch." I said, "She asked me for the rematch." She was quiet again. Then she said, "I need you to understand that this is the most you thing that has ever happened in your entire life." I said I thought that was probably fair. She said, "Are you going back Thursday?" I said, "Yes, yes." "Good. Go." I went back Thursday. And the Thursday after that. And the one after that. What grew between Elise and me across those Thursdays grew the only way real things grow, which is slowly, with setbacks. And with the particular patience of 2 people who have both been burned badly enough by the fast version that they had no interest in repeating it. Marcus Hale made himself correctly scarce. He was present in the way fathers are present, in the knowledge that if you needed him he was there, but he did not hover, and he did not perform, and he did not once, in all the months that followed, refer to the announcement he had made at the dinner party. Gerald, the household manager, warmed to me by degrees, which is to say that by February he stopped looking at me like furniture, and by March he started having coffee ready when I arrived. That is as warm as Gerald gets, and it felt like plenty. I am going to skip ahead, because this is not a story about courtship, and I do not want to make it into one. What I want to tell you is about a morning 8 months later, in July, when Elise came to my house for the first time. My house is a 2-bedroom on Clement Street, 19 years of a garbage man's salary, and a lot of careful choices. It is not a large house or a stylish one, but every room in it is full of things that mean something to me. The kitchen table where I taught Josie chess, the bookshelf my grandfather built by hand, the good chair by the window where I read in the evenings when the work is done. Elise stood in the doorway of the kitchen and looked around. She did not perform a reaction. She just looked. Then she sat down at the kitchen table, the one with the worn corner where Josie used to rest her chin when she was small, and she looked at the chessboard I had left set up there. Mid-game from a practice problem I had been working through the night before. She moved a piece without asking. I moved one back. We played at the kitchen table for 2 hours while the morning came through the window and Josie texted me 17 times, and I ignored all of them and answered them all at once afterward. What I want you to understand, and this is the thing I come back to, the thing that keeps being true the more I turn it over, is that nothing about any of this was a fairy tale. Nobody was rescued. Nobody was transformed. A woman who had spent years being treated like a destination got to spend some Thursday evenings being treated like a person. A man who had spent years being treated like furniture got to sit in a warm room and play the game his grandfather taught him with someone who took it as seriously as he did. And somewhere in the middle of all those Thursday evenings, both of us quietly decided that the company of someone who saw you clearly was worth more than everything the people performing for the gallery would ever offer. Marcus Hale walked me to my car one evening in December and said, unprompted, without sentimentality, "You know what the condition was actually about?" I said I thought I did. He said, "I was not looking for a man who could win. Winning is easy for the right kind of man at the right kind of problem. I was looking for a man who would show up when there was nothing in it for him. I had nothing to give you that Tuesday night. You had no reason to believe anything would come of it. You came anyway. That is the only thing I ever actually needed to see." I did not say anything for a moment. Then I said, "She reminded me of my grandfather, not in any specific way, just in the way some people hold the game, like it matters." like it is connected to something bigger than the board. He nodded slowly. He said, "Yes, that is exactly what her mother used to say about her." I drove home on the Reservoir Road, the same way I had driven home that first November night, and I thought about all the things that get passed down across generations without anyone meaning to pass them down. The way my grandfather sat at the board. The way Josie rests her chin on her hand when she is thinking. The specific quality of silence in a room when a game is being played by people who understand that they are really talking about something else. You cannot buy that silence. You cannot engineer it. You can only show up for enough years, with enough honesty, and let it grow on its own at whatever pace it chooses. The city of Millhaven goes on exactly as it did. I still drive the route. I still know which houses generate what kind of waste, and what that tells me about the lives being lived inside them. I am still invisible to most of the people whose trash I take away, and I have made my peace with that the same way I made my peace with everything else that cannot be changed, by understanding that invisible is not the same as unimportant. And that the things done without an audience are usually the things that matter most. Josie came for dinner on a Sunday in March. She and Elise talked for 4 hours, and I mostly stayed in the kitchen pretending to be busy, which is a thing fathers do when they want their children to have a conversation without them. When I came out, they were at the kitchen table with the chessboard between them. Mid-game, Josie's chin resting in her hand exactly the way it had when she was 7 years old. And Elise was looking at her with the expression I had only seen her use at the board, when she was genuinely interested in what the other person was going to do next. That expression, right there, was the whole thing. That was the point of all of it. Not the announcement at the dinner party, not the 7 men who had tried and failed, not the improbable fact of a garbage man walking through a front door on a Tuesday evening. Just 2 people who had both learned to see clearly, passing that skill around a table, adding one more person to the circle. My grandfather would have liked Elise. He would have liked that she holds the game the way he did, like it is a conversation, not a contest. He would have sat across from her at this kitchen table and played without speaking, and afterward, he would have nodded once in that way he had and gone to put the kettle on. That nod was the highest compliment he knew how to give. I think about it some evenings when the route is done and the house is quiet. I think about what it means to be handed something by someone who is gone, something you did not ask for and cannot explain to someone who did not receive the same thing. The game, the patience, the understanding that showing up for something without knowing what will come of it is not naivety. It is the only kind of faith worth having. So here is what I want to ask you before you go, and I mean it as a real question, not a flourish. Think about the last time someone showed up for you when there was nothing in it for them. When they were not performing, not angling, not waiting for the return. Just there, just present, just honest. Have you told them what that meant to you? Because those people are rare in a world that is very good at producing the performance of care and very bad at producing the real thing. They deserve to know. Leave their name in the comments below. I read every one, and I would be honored to know who has been that person in your life. And if this story reached something in you, if you believe the way I have come to believe it, down in the steady, quiet part of a person, that what the world calls ordinary is usually where the only things worth finding actually live, then do one small thing before you move on. Hit that subscribe button, drop a like so someone else finds their way here, and leave your story in the comments. I will see you in the next one. I promise, it is worth staying for.